Stand in the middle of the great hall and look up, and there is nothing between you and the sky. No ceiling, no painted gods leaning down out of a dome. Only open air, weather, and the raw upper edges of stone walls that have not carried a roof in 200 years. Rain falls straight through onto the floor where a family once received its guests. Birds cross the opening the way they would cross a canyon. This is the beating centre of Seaton Delaval Hall, today a Grade Y listed National Trust property at Seaton Sluice in Northumberland, on the cold northeast coast of England, and its most famous room is a room with no lid, a stone box pointed at the clouds. Around you, the walls still hold their shape. Fluted pilasters climb toward that missing ceiling. Set in niches, a handful of scorched allegorical figures keep their poses, carved women meant to stand for architecture and music and painting, their faces softened by fire and pocked by something harder than fire. The floor is swept and level. Visitors move through in coats, cameras up, voices low, because a roofless great hall does that to people. It makes them quiet. It makes them look up. Now pull the whole scene back 300 years to 1718 and stand instead with two men who commissioned and drew this room and never once walked into it finished. One was a sailor, turned admiral, near the end of a long climb, with money to spend and a name to plant in the ground. The other was the most daring builder England had, a playwright who had learned to build palaces, working on what would be his last country house. Between them, they raised the walls you are standing inside. Neither of them lived to see the roof go on. That is where this begins. The man with the money was Admiral George Delaval, and in 1718 he was about 50 years old. In that year, he bought the Seaton Delaval estate outright. The seller was his own cousin, Sir John Delaval, the third baronet, a man of the same blood and the same name who had run out of both luck and cash. The Delavals were not newcomers to this ground. They had held land here since the Norman conquest, more than 6 centuries of continuous ownership, a lineage most English families could only envy. But long possession is not the same as wealth. By the early 1700s, the old line was sinking under debt, the estate carrying its Norman inheritance like damp that has worked so deep into old stone that no fire and no summer will ever fully drive it out. The land was ancient. The account books were ruined, so the estate passed sideways from the poor Delaval to the rich one, from the baronet who had inherited everything to the admiral who had inherited almost nothing. And that gap between the two cousins is the real engine of this whole story, because George Delaval had not been handed a fortune. He had built one. His father left him £100. That was the whole of it. In an age when great houses changed hands for tens of thousands, when a single good estate could cost a fortune, the younger George Delaval began adult life, holding a sum thin as a single sheet of paper, an inheritance you could fold once and put in a pocket. Men have started with less, but not many men, starting with that little, have ended by commissioning one of the boldest houses in England. What he did not inherit in money, he made at sea. The Royal Navy was the ladder, and he climbed every rung of it. By 1693, he was third lieutenant aboard HMS Lennox. By 1700, he had his own command, captain of HMS Tilbury. And on 24th August 1704, he took the Tilbury into the Battle of Malaga, one of the largest naval actions of the War of the Spanish Succession, a long day of broadsides in the western Mediterranean off the Spanish coast. Fighting at sea in that era was close, loud, and lethal, hulls hammering hulls within pistol shot. Delaval came through it a made man, the kind of officer the Crown could trust with more than a ship. What the Crown gave him next was not another deck, but a country. In 1707 he went to Lisbon as an envoy trading the quarterdeck for the negotiating table. In 1708, he reached an agreement with the Sultan of Morocco. From 1710 to 1714, he served as British ambassador to Portugal, a full diplomatic posting in one of the Crown's most important Allied capitals during a European war. A boy with £100 had become a man who spoke for kingdoms, and a diplomat with an ambassador's standing draws an ambassador's rewards. Naval pay, the settlements of a long fighting career, the salaries of years of foreign service, all of it pooled into the private fortune of a man who had started with nothing and intended to show it. By 1718, the year he bought Seaton Delaval, he was promoted Rear Admiral. By 1722, he would be Vice Admiral. He was, in every sense the age understood, a success, and he wanted a house that said so in stone. He had already shown how far he was willing to reach. 2 years before he bought the family estate, in 1716, he had purchased the nearby Bavington Hall for £5,000. Set that against the £100 his father left him, and you can measure the whole arc of the man in 2 numbers. He had turned a single sheet of paper into estates, and Bavington was only the warm-up. What he wanted at Seaton Delaval Hall was not a comfortable house on old land. He wanted a monument. For that, he needed the right architect, and in 1718, there was really only one name that fit the size of his ambition. Sir John Vanbrugh had come to building by a strange road. He had been a soldier, then a prisoner of the French, then, of all things, a successful playwright, writing comedies for the London stage before he had ever drawn a facade. Then, without formal training, he had turned architect and produced 2 of the most colossal houses in the country. Castle Howard in Yorkshire was his, that vast domed pile rising out of the Howardian hills, and Blenheim Palace was his too, the enormous Baroque prize built by a grateful nation for the Duke of Marlborough. No English architect worked at a grander scale, and none had a bolder eye for weight, shadow, and sheer theatrical mass. By 1718, Vanbrugh was in his 50s, his greatest commissions largely behind him. When George Delaval came to him wanting a replacement house on the Northumberland coast, a new block to sweep away whatever the impoverished cousins had left standing, Vanbrugh took the job. It would prove to be his last country house commission, the final time he was given open ground, a demanding client, and the freedom to compose. Everything he had learned across the drama of Castle Howard and the bulk of Blenheim he could pour into one more design, on a windswept site above the sea, for a patron who had spent his whole life proving that a man could rise beyond his birth. That is the pairing at the heart of it. On one side, the Admiral, about 50, self-made ambassador, Rear Admiral, holder of an estate his family had owned since the conquest and nearly lost to debt. On the other, the playwright turned master builder, near the end of his working life, with 2 palaces already behind him and one last house left in him. 2 men at the peaks of 2 extraordinary careers, meeting over a piece of ground on the edge of England. And here is the cruel joke the years were setting up, though neither man could see it in 1718. Look again at what the site would become. The stark sculptural block they planned, all deep shadow and heavy stone, would take a full 10 years to build, from 1718 to 1728. 10 years is a long time for men already past 50. The Admiral would be dead before the walls were finished, thrown from his horse within sight of the house he was paying for. The architect would be dead 2 years after that, an old man in London killed by his own failing lungs, having visited the building site in person only a handful of times. The room, with no roof, that you began this story standing inside, the swept stone hall open to the Northumberland sky, would be finished by other hands, lived in by other Delavals, and would go on to outlast every one of them. But none of that has happened yet. In 1718, the two men are alive, and the ground is empty, and the money is real. Stand with them one more time on that bare site above Seaton Sluice, the old debt-driven cousins bought out, the ancient name secured, the sea wind coming off the water, and understand exactly what is about to be attempted here. A man who began with £100 is about to commission the finest and last house of the boldest architect in England. He is not doing it carefully. He has already shown at Bavington and everywhere else that he spends at the scale of his ambition, not the scale of caution. He has the money, he has the site, he has the man. What he does not yet have, what the next 10 years will decide, is whether that ambition can be finished before the men behind it run out of time. In 1718, Admiral George Delaval handed his whole ambition to one man, Sir John Vanbrugh, and everything now turned on how large a fortune he was willing to pour into the ground at Seaton Delaval Hall. In 1718, Admiral George Delaval handed his whole ambition to one man, Sir John Vanbrugh, and everything now turned on how large a fortune he was willing to pour into the ground at Seaton Delaval Hall. To understand the house that rose on this ground, you have first to understand the purse behind it, and that purse had been filling for the better part of 40 years. George Delaval had not been born to money. What he had made himself, out at sea and in the courts of foreign kings, across a long career that carried him from the deck of a warship to the standing of an ambassador. Naval pay, the rewards that came with command, the allowances of a diplomat kept abroad in the service of the crown, all of it accumulated slowly and steadily into the one kind of fortune a man could, if he chose, set down permanently in stone. It was not a single windfall. There was no famous haul of treasure, no one great prize that fell into his lap and made him rich in an afternoon. It was the patient work of decades, and by 1718 he plainly meant to spend it on something that would outlast him. The clearest sign of what he intended had come 2 years before the estate here was even his. In 1716, Delaval bought the nearby Bavington Hall for £5,000. Hold that figure against where the man had started. This was someone whose father, by the account that survives, had left him a legacy of just £100. In a single purchase of land, he now laid out 50 times that entire inheritance, and Bavington was not even to be his great house. It was a holding, an acquisition, a piece of the county gathered up almost in passing. When a man will spend £5,000 on a secondary estate, the question is no longer whether he can afford ambition. The question is only how far that ambition will run once he finds an architect willing to match it. In Vanbrugh, he found exactly that man, and by 1720, Vanbrugh had completed the design. That fact is worth pausing on because it tells you how the whole work was actually carried out. Vanbrugh was not a resident architect standing over the masons through every course of stone. He was among the most sought-after men in England, already famous for the great sweep of Castle Howard and for the enormous pile of Blenheim. And his method here reflected that standing. He conceived the house, he fixed its character on paper, and then he entrusted the long labour of raising it to other hands. In person, he came to the site only twice. Twice, across the entire span of the building. The first visit fell in March 1720, and the second in August 1721, and on each of those occasions he came to settle the main features, to confirm the shape and the massing, and the great decisions that no letter could safely carry. Then he rode away again. Everything between those two visits and everything after the second went forward without him bodily present. For a house so completely stamped with the imagination of one man, it remains a strange and telling thing that its author stood on its ground on only 2 days we can name. Someone had to be there in all the seasons when Vanbrugh was not, and that someone was William Etty. Etty, born around 1675 and dead by 1734, was Vanbrugh's regular builder and surveyor, the practical figure who turned the architect's drawings into cut stone and standing wall. It fell to Etty to manage the day-to-day business of the construction, to deal with the workmen and the quarried material and the 100 small problems a building site throws up between one winter and the next. Vanbrugh supplied the vision from a distance. Etty supplied the years of close, patient oversight that turned that vision into something you could walk inside. The house we hang on a single famous name was, in the ordinary daily sense, held together by the other man entirely, season after season, while its designer worked elsewhere. And behind both of them stood the Admiral, paying. Here Vanbrugh himself hands us the single most revealing line in the whole story. In a letter that survives, the architect set down his patron's spirit in the work. The Admiral, he wrote, was very gallant in his operations, not being disposed to starve the design at all. Read that slowly, because it is the entire relationship folded into one sentence. Very gallant in his operations, not disposed to starve the design. This was not a client who fixed a hard figure and demanded that his architect trim every dream to fit it. This was a client who told his architect, in effect, to build the thing properly, and who then kept the money moving so that the design was never once starved of what it asked for. That is the rarest gift an architect can be given, and Vanbrugh knew its value exactly. Most great houses are a negotiation, a long-running argument between what the designer wants and what the owner will actually pay for, and the compromises reached in that argument show plainly in the finished stone. Here there was no such argument to lose. The purse simply stayed open, and the design kept its full appetite. The building ran a decade, from 1718 to 1728. As for what all of it finally cost, the honest answer is that we do not fully know. One source puts the total at around £10,000. It is a plausible sum for a work of this scale and this daring, but it must be handled with real care, for it is confirmed nowhere else, and no other surviving record corroborates it. Treat it, then, as a figure reported rather than a fact settled, a number handed down without the ledgers to stand behind it. What we can say with confidence is not the exact total, but the shape of the spending. A fortune assembled across decades at sea and in foreign service was poured, without stinting and without pause, into a single block of stone over the course of 10 years. Picture how that money behaved on the ground. A cautious man's budget is a locked box, counted and guarded and opened only when forced. The Admiral's budget stood open the way an unlocked cellar stands open, its door left wide, its contents there for the taking whenever the work called for more. Nobody had to break into it. When the design wanted another course of dressed stone, another span, another refinement that a nervous patron would have struck through, the money was already there, waiting, unguarded. That openness is the thing that made the house possible at all, and you can read it now in every unhurried, uncompromised line of the finished block. Because the finished block is like almost nothing else in England. What Vanbrugh raised on this moor was not a comfortable country seat softened for easy living. It was a stark, sculptural statement in the full English Baroque manner, heavy and powerful and deliberately severe, a composition of towers and rusticated stone and deep cast shadow that seems less designed than carved. Stand well back from it, and the impression is not of a house assembled slowly piece by piece, but of a single mass cut whole from the Northumberland moorland, one clean bite of the chisel taken out of the hard northern ground, and stood upright against a cold sky. There is a unity to the thing, a completeness that you only ever get when one imagination has been allowed to finish its own thought without interruption. Architectural historians have long understood what that unity is worth. Vanbrugh built larger houses than this. He built more famous ones, but many who study his work judge this to be his finest achievement, the purest and most concentrated thing he ever managed to make, and they judge it so for a precise and simple reason. Everywhere else, the man had to bend. At Blenheim, he fought the Duchess of Marlborough over every last expense, and was in the end driven off the work altogether. On other commissions, the money ran thin, or the owner lost his nerve, or the grand plan was quietly cut down to save a few pounds. Here, and only here, he was handed a client who would not starve the design, and a purse that would not close, and given those two things together, he built without compromise of any kind. The severity of the result is not a limitation forced on him. It is the sound of an architect refusing to soften anything at all, because for once in his life, nobody was standing behind him making him do it. That is the quiet miracle sitting at the center of this whole story, and it is worth holding firmly before we go on. A boy who inherited £100 turned it, through a lifetime of hard service at sea and in the courts of Europe, into a fortune large enough to commission the finest work of the greatest dramatic architect of the age, and then had both the confidence and the plain generosity to stand back and let that architect do exactly as he wished. The building is the proof of the two men at once. The daring of the design belongs to Vanbrugh. The freedom that let the daring stand belongs entirely to the Admiral who paid for it. But freedom of that kind takes years to spend, and years were the one currency neither man had truly banked. The house that would need a full decade to raise was being built by an architect who had already, by the late summer of 1721, done very nearly all he ever meant to do on its ground, and it was being built for a patron whose own time was quietly draining away beneath him even as the walls climbed. The design was fixed. The money was flowing. Etty was on site, season upon season, turning drawings into stone. Everything was in motion, and everything now needed only the one thing that could not be bought. By August 1721, Sir John Vanbrugh had fixed the design and walked away, and the two men who mattered most to Seaton Delaval Hall, the Admiral and his architect, were each already running out of years. By August 1721, Sir John Vanbrugh had fixed the design and walked away, and the two men who mattered most to Seaton Delaval Hall, the Admiral and his architect, were each already running out of years. Neither of them knew it. The stone was still going up. The great block was rising course by course out of the Northumberland ground. William Etty, on site, managing the masons and the carts and the lead, the shape of the thing already unmistakable against the sea light, but the two names on the whole enterprise, the man who paid for it and the man who drew it, had almost no time left. What happened next is not legend, and it is not a curse. It is a sequence of dated deaths, each one a matter of record, and the record begins on a summer day less than 2 years after Vanbrugh's final visit. On 22nd of June 1723, Admiral George Delaval rode out on his own land. He was about 55 years old. He had built his whole life out of a single inheritance of £100, turned it into a naval and diplomatic fortune across 30 years at sea and in foreign courts, risen to captain, to envoy, to ambassador, to rear admiral, and only lately to vice admiral. He had bought this estate from his own impoverished cousin so that he could raise on it the finest house in the north of England. And on that June day his horse threw him, or fell with him, a few hundred yards from his own unfinished front door. The Admiral died of it. He was killed within sight of the walls he was paying to raise, on the very ground he had bought for the purpose, and the house that was to be the monument of his career was nowhere near ready to receive his body or his old age. An obelisk was later put up on the spot where he fell. It is a plain, hard marker, and it does something the finished house could never do. It fixes the exact place. It says, here, not at the door, not on the threshold, but here in the open field, a short walk short of the goal, the man who commissioned the whole thing ran out of ground. He never saw the hall completed. He never slept a night under its roof. He had commanded a ship of the line at the Battle of Malaga, negotiated with the Sultan of Morocco, represented the crown at Lisbon, and he died in a field on his own property because a horse moved wrong beneath him. Every stone that went up after that summer went up for a dead man. The work did not stop. The Admiral had money enough put aside and heirs enough to see it through, and so the masons kept climbing. But the second name on the building was fading now too. Sir John Vanbrugh, playwright turned architect, the man who had already given England Castle, Howard and Blenheim, was an old man in London with a labouring chest. This house in Northumberland was his last country commission, his final essay in stone, the sternest and most sculptural thing he ever designed, and he had stood on the site in person only twice in his life, in the spring of 1720 and the late summer of 1721. He fixed the main features on those two visits and then trusted the rest to other hands. On 26th of March 1726, Vanbrugh died at his home in London of an asthma attack. He was 62. The house was still 2 full years from completion. The architect of what many would come to call his masterpiece died with the building unfinished, having laid eyes on the site only twice, never once standing inside the great sculptural hall he had drawn. That is the plain fact the whole title of this story turns on. The patron died in 1723 in a field. The architect died in 1726 in a London bedroom, short of breath. Between them, they had conceived the most ambitious private house of their generation, and between them they saw not one finished room of it. When the last of the scaffolding finally came down, both men who had willed the thing into being were already in their graves. It was 1728 before anyone actually lived there. 10 years had passed since the Admiral bought the estate. The man who moved in was not the Admiral, of course, but his nephew and heir, Captain Francis Blake Delaval, born in 1692, who came to the completed house with his wife Rhoda and their children. They were the first Delavals to sleep under that finished roof, the first to walk the great cold rooms as a home rather than a building site. The house had taken a decade, had swallowed a fortune, had cost its patron and its architect their lives before either could enjoy it, and only in 1728 did it hold a living family at last. You might think that with the family finally installed, the run of bad ends was over. It was not over. It had barely begun. For a generation, the house did what such houses do. It held a family. It held their portraits, and their furniture, and their ambitions. Francis Blake Delaval lived in it for the better part of a quarter century. And then, on 9 December 1752, he came to the steps of the South Portico of the house he had inherited. The South Portico steps are stone, and they wait cold and hard underfoot in a Northumberland December, offering nothing to a foot that misjudges them. He fell down them. He died of the injuries. He was in his 60th year, and he had died of a fall on the estate, exactly as his uncle the Admiral had died of a fall on the same estate 29 years before. 2 masters of the house, 2 heads of the family, 2 fatal falls on the same ground within a single generation. The first died in the field before the door. The second died on the steps of the door itself. This is not a story of a believed curse, because no Delaval of the time is recorded as speaking of one. It is something colder and more exact than that. It is a pattern you can date to the day. The children Francis Blake Delaval left behind became the people the county remembered longest, and not for their virtues. They were called the Gay Delavals, and the name meant then roughly what it suggested: bright, extravagant, theatrical, reckless with money and reputation alike. They staged amateur plays and pantomimes in the great rooms. They filled the house with actors and gaming and noise, and chief among them was the eldest son and heir, Sir Francis Blake Delaval, born in 1727, a celebrated rake in an age that produced a good many of them. He gambled on a scale that is hard to credit. He kept actresses as mistresses. He was sued for adultery by his own wife. He poured the accumulated Delaval money, the fortune the Admiral had built out of £100 and a lifetime at sea, straight out through the gaming tables like water through a cracked pail, faster than any estate could refill it. The wealth that had been 30 years in the earning drained away across a few years of cards and display, and it did not come back. It got so bad that the matter left the family entirely and went to Parliament. Sir Francis Blake Delaval had so encumbered the estate with his debts that an Act was required to strip the property out of his control and settle it on his younger brother John, so that the land might survive its own heir. Think on that. The Admiral had built the house to be the permanent seat of his line, and within 2 generations the state had to intervene by statute to save it from the man who had inherited it. The rake died in 1771. He did not bring the house down in fire or fall, but he came closer than either to erasing what the Admiral had made by the slow ruin of the account books. The last of the run belongs to the next boy in line. John Delaval, born in 1756, was the son of that same brother, John, who had been handed the rescued estate. He was the heir, the future of the whole enterprise, 19 years old. In July 1775, he died. The manner of it is the strangest of all the strange ends in this family. He was, in the language of the time, paying his addresses to a laundry maid of the household, and she kicked him, and the injury killed him. 19 years old, heir to a barony and a great house, and dead of a kick from a servant girl he was pressing his attentions on. His father was undone by it. He had the interior of the church at Doddington painted black for the funeral, black walls for a black grief, and he raised a mausoleum within half a mile of the hall to hold the boy's memory. A field, a flight of steps, a laundry room, 3 heirs, 3 sudden ends across the Admiral, his nephew, and his great-nephew, each one dated, each one named, none of it invented. Set them in a row, and the shape is undeniable and needs no embroidery. Admiral George Delaval, thrown from his horse in his own field on 22nd June 1723, dead before the house was built. Vanbrugh, the architect, dead of asthma in London on 26th of March 1726, 2 years short of seeing it done. Captain Francis Blake Delaval, the first man to live in the finished house, dead at the foot of its own South Portico steps on Lincoln December 1752. The heir, John Delaval, kicked to death by a laundry maid in July 1775 at 19. And around them the whole fortune, the naval pay, and the diplomatic postings, and the long, careful accumulation of a lifetime, bled out through the gaming tables of a celebrated rake until Parliament itself had to be called in to hold the walls together. The house stood through all of it. It outlasted the man who paid for it, and the man who designed it, and the men who inherited it in turn. It held its ground, while the family that owned it kept meeting the ground the hard way, in the field, on the steps, in the laundry. And still the walls stood. That was the terrible constancy of the place. The people died in falls and in follies and in freak violence, and the great sculptural block that Vanbrugh drew and never entered, went on standing over them, roofed, glazed, complete at last, and outliving everyone who had ever hoped to own it in peace. By the turn of the new century, the gay Delavals were gone, and their scandals were cooling into anecdote, and the house that had cost so many of its own family so dearly seemed at least to have won its long argument with time. It had survived the deaths of both the men who made it. It had survived the ruin of the men who inherited it. Stone does not fall from a horse. Stone does not gamble. Whatever had come for the Delavals, one by one, and always by accident, had never once been able to come for the house itself, until it came as fire. On the 3rd of January 1822, a fire tore through the central block and left Seaton Delaval Hall a gutted shell, roofless and open to the Northumberland sky. On 3rd of January 1822, a fire tore through the central block and left Seaton Delaval Hall a gutted shell, roofless and open to the Northumberland sky. No one died that night. That is worth holding on to, because almost everything else about this house had been paid for in bodies, and here at last was a catastrophe that took only the building. But the building was the whole point, and what the fire did to it was total. The floors of the central block gave way and fell in on themselves. The great staircase, iron-framed, and once the proudest interior gesture in the place, buckled and folded in the heat until the metal itself lost its shape. Window glass ran. Laid came off the roof in molten lines down the stone. When the flames finally died, there was a stone box standing open to the weather, its insides burned out, its ceilings gone, its roof simply not there anymore. The traditional account, the one every telling of the house repeats, is that jackdaws had built their nests in one of the chimneys, and that a blocked flue set the whole thing alight. It is the kind of small domestic cause that fits a house with such a large sense of doom, and it may well be true, but it is worth saying plainly that it is tradition and not a recorded certainty. What is certain is what survived. The two flanking wings came through. The east stable wing, where the horses had been kept in more grandeur than most people were housed, stood almost untouched. The west kitchen wing, the working end of the house, also escaped. Only the central block, the piece that mattered, the piece Vanbrugh had drawn as the whole reason for the design, was destroyed. And then nothing happened for 40 years. That is the fact that is hardest to picture. A building of this scale and this ambition, one of the most remarkable houses in the north of England, stood empty and roofless and open to the rain for 4 decades. Grass and weather got into it. The stone soaked and dried and soaked again through 40 winters. The roofless hall was held open to the sky like a hand extended empty, waiting for something to be set into it, and for 40 years nothing was. The first person to do anything serious about it was a Newcastle architect named John Dobson. Between 1862 and 1863, Dobson carried out the first real intervention since the fire. He shored up the saloon, the great central room, with iron columns and brick, propping the wounded structure so that it would stop losing itself to gravity. And then he did the thing no one had done in 40 years. He put a roof back over the building, the first roof it had carried since 1822. It was not a restoration in any full sense. It was a rescue, a way of stopping the ruin from becoming a heap. But it meant the house was covered again, and covered is the difference between a building and a memory. The house went on being useful in the plainest ways through the century that followed. During the First World War, it was requisitioned by the Northumberland volunteers and put to military use. During the Second World War, it served as a prisoner of war camp, its baroque rooms holding men behind wire. There is something almost fitting in that. A house built to overawe, to make a statement about a family's power, spent the 20th century being borrowed for whatever the country happened to need. In 1950, Seaton Delaval Hall opened to the public for the first time. People who had never had any claim on the Delaval name could now walk up to the front, go inside, stand in the burned central block, and look up at the sky through the hole the fire had made. And in those same middle decades, the family, or what the title had become of it, finally came back to the work of saving the place. Edward Delaval, Henry Astley, the 22nd Baron Hastings, born in 1912 and living until 2007, took on the restoration of the house and gave the better part of his life to it. His work on the building is reported as spanning some 51 years, which is to say he spent longer restoring the house than most of its early owners had spent alive. In the 1980s, the family moved into the West Wing. That detail carries more weight than it seems to. For roughly 160 years, the house had had no permanent occupant. Since the fire, and in truth since long before it, this enormous structure had stood without anyone actually living in it. Now, after a century and a half of emptiness, a family slept in it again. But one family, however devoted, could not carry a building of this size forever. And the last chapter of its survival belongs to an institution rather than a bloodline. On the 1st September 2008, the National Trust launched an appeal to raise £6.3 million, enough to take the hall, its gardens and its grounds into permanent care. It was a public campaign for a public treasure, and admission that the house had outgrown any private owner. In December 2009, the appeal succeeded. The money was raised, the trust took ownership, and the hall reopened to visitors under a form of guardianship designed to outlast any single lifetime. The care did not stop there. In 2018, the hall closed for a refurbishment costing £3.7 million, funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund. More money and more work poured into a structure that had once been left to rot for 40 years. In October 2021, Seaton Delaval Hall was named among 142 places sharing a £35 million Government Culture Recovery Fund allocation, its portion going toward repairs to the sea-facing walls and the stone corbels that the weather off the North Sea never stops attacking. A house abandoned within living memory of nobody was now being maintained by the machinery of an entire nation's heritage, one grant and one appeal at a time. So what does a visitor actually find today? A house that is protected at the highest level the country offers. The building is Grade 1 listed, the strongest designation there is, reserved for places of exceptional interest. The 18th century gardens around it are listed Grade 2 star, a step below the house itself but far above the ordinary. It is owned and run by the National Trust, its future as secure as any old building's future ever is. And at its heart, the central Great Hall, the room the fire gutted in 1822, is still roofless. This is the detail that catches everyone who learns it. The hall has no roof, not because the money ran out or the work is unfinished, but because keeping it open to the sky is now a deliberate conservation choice. The decision has been made to leave the wound open. The building is preserved as a ruin at its centre and as a house at its edges, and the two states are held together on purpose. Stand in that hall and think about what you are standing in. The iron of the old staircase twisted in the heat of the 1822 fire like wax run off a candle, and the shape of that ruin is now fixed, conserved, kept. Above you is open air, the same opening the flames burned through the roof 200 years ago. Around you are the walls Vanbrugh designed, the proportions he set down on paper, the sculptural Baroque block that architectural historians still call his finest work. And here is the thing that makes this room unlike almost any other great room in England. You are standing in the exact space that Sir John Vanbrugh drew, and that Sir John Vanbrugh never once stood in himself. He visited the site only twice while it was going up, and he was dead 2 years before it was finished. The patron who paid for it, Admiral George Delaval, was dead 5 years before that, killed by a fall from his horse, within sight of the unfinished walls. The two men whose house this was never crossed its completed threshold, and now the room they made stands open to the weather, letting anyone at all come in and look up through the roof that fire and time and choice have left off. The damaged statues are still there too, the 18th century allegorical figures that survived both the fire and the party guests who once shot at them for sport, conserved now in the space they have never left. They have outlasted the family that mistreated them. So has the hall. That is the shape of the whole story, if you stand back far enough to see it. 3 generations of Delavals died in falls and freak accidents and scandal. The Admiral fell from his horse. His nephew fell down the steps of his own portico. The next heir died of an injury that tradition will not quite let us name. They kept dying, one after another, as if the house itself demanded it, and the house they were dying for burned to a shell and stood empty and roofless while they were all safely in their graves. The building outlived every one of them. It outlived them by the exact margin they had spent their lives being taken from it. Vanbrugh drew it, George Delaval paid for it, and neither man ever stood beneath its finished roof, yet 300 years on it is the empty hall itself, open to the sky since 1822, and held now by the National Trust that has outlasted every Delaval who ever died trying to own it.